Start recording, Robert.
Let's establish a few principles with regard to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and specifically as it relates to another mitzvah that's very, very close, and that's the mitzvah of Chinuch. Principle number one is that the Rambam opens up Hilchos Talmud Torah by establishing that the father has to teach his son Torah, even though the son is young, he's a katan, and that obligation begins when the child is capable of speaking. And the Rambam derives that principle, that obligation incumbent upon the father from the pasuk, "V'limadatem osam es b'nechem." And the question arises, and we touched upon it in the past, I want to get into it more in depth today. Does the father have a mitzvah of chinuch? In every mitzvah, the Rambam formulates the obligation of the father to teach his son, whether it be the mitzvah of tefillin, of tzitzis, of tainis, of lulav and sukkah, and the list goes on and on. The Rambam seems to have omitted the mitzvah of chinuch with regard to Talmud Torah. And this led us to the second principle, and that is that Talmud Torah is different than every other mitzvah, and it doesn't have, therefore, a mitzvah of chinuch, because the Torah itself obligates the father to teach his son Torah. So even before the Chachamim step into the rink and obligate the father as chinuch, which is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, the Torah has already preempted the Rabbanan insofar as it's established an obligation on the father to teach his son Torah. There's no point and there's no justification for the Chachamim to pile up on top of the chiyuv that the Torah obligated the father, another chiyuv rabbinically of chinuch, because at the end of the day, the father's going to teach his son Torah in order to fulfill the obligation of a mitzvah d'oraisa v'limadatem osam es b'nechem. So why add a mitzvah of chinuch on top of a mitzvah d'oraisa? That's pointless. In the case of Kriyat Shema or tzitzis or tefillin, nowhere does the Torah obligate the father to teach his son tzitzis, lulav, sukkah, tefillin, etc., etc. So therefore, the Rabbanan stepped up and they established an obligation of chinuch. But in Talmud Torah, that was totally unnecessary. Would have been absolutely meaningless to add chinuch as an obligation d'Rabbanan to a mitzvah d'oraisa. The third principle that we derive from the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah is that a katan hayodeh ledaber will be taught psukim in the Torah, and that's meaningful. When the child enunciates psukim in the Torah, he's a child of 2 or 3 years old, hardly understands the psukim. Here in Israel, maybe if he's brought up with Hebrew language, but certainly not in Chutz La'aretz. So what's the point? Just to have the child enunciate words without understanding their meaning? Is that Talmud Torah? And this led us to the third principle, then, that with regard to Kriyas Psukim, that means Torah Shebichsav, there's a marvelous, amazing chidush that we don't find in general with regard to Talmud Torah, and that is that reading the words and the psukim of Torah Shebichsav, the written Torah, has meaning unto itself. It's called Mikra, and it generates a kiyum of Talmud Torah. And this has various implications. For example, someone who doesn't understand Torah, can he make the bracha on the Torah, whether it be the morning bracha of Birchas HaTorah, whether it be if he gets an aliyah? And the answer is yes, because we're talking about Torah Shebichsav. And with regard to Torah Shebichsav, even without Havana, minus your understanding, you still have a kiyum of Talmud Torah. Hence, the Torah obligates the father to teach his son Torah, Mishiyodea hakoton lidaber, even if I grant you the koton is too young to understand. He will, in effect, parrot his father and recite psukim without understanding them, and that will be a fulfillment of the mitzvah d'oraisa of limad tamosim esmenechem, because with regard to Torah Shebichsav, there's an unbelievable halacha, a principle that there's a kiyum of a mitzvah even if you don't understand what you're reading. That would not apply to Torah Sheba'al Peh. So what we've suggested so far is kind of a recap summarizing the main points that we made until this point. But let's move over to Chinuch for a moment, and then we'll come back to Talmud Torah. We find something very, very profound in a brisa in Masechtas Sukkah, and that's codified by the Rambam over and over and over again throughout his Mishnah Torah, and that is that when we talk about a shiur called Katan Shehigia Lechinuch, let's start with what it doesn't mean, meaning we'll have the brackets with a negative sign. It does not mean that the katan is capable of doing the basics, the bare bones of the mitzvah. For example, the bare bones of lulav is just simply to lift the lulav, meaning the talmidim, off the table. A katan who's capable of lifting the lulav off the table is not yet included and does not generate upon the father an obligation of chinuch. The brisa says in Sukkah he has to be yodel linanea. Nanuim is a higher level, what we called a shleimus of the mitzvah of lulav. And so too, with regard to tzitzis, it's not enough that he could put the tzitzis on his body. The katan is still not higia lechinuch until he reaches the shleimus hamitzvah, which is called ituf, ayin yud tet vav fe. Now, exactly what ituf is, don't ask me, because there are a couple of different shitos, and the only thing I can tell you that I do understand is that when you do ituf, be careful that there are two tzitzis in front of you, two corners, and two behind you. Notwithstanding the Yemenite minhag of the Teimanim, they put all four in front of them. I don't know how to make sense out of that, but leave that, till you go to Teimani school. You'll ask me when you get to Teimani school. Anyway, and with regard to tefillin, it's not enough that the child could put on the tefillin. He has to know what's called lishmares tefillah, which is a much older child. And that led us to the principle that underlies the mitzvah of chinuch, that chinuch only applies when the child is capable of shleimus ha-mitzvah, not the basics of the mitzvah, but the full-fledged chiyuv of the mitzvah. In Kriyat Shema, that would mean that the child is capable of reciting 3 parshios. And even though the Rambam speaks at the beginning of Talmud Torah about teaching the child one pasuk, the first pasuk of Kriyat Shema, that's not Chinuch. That's a mitzvah doraisa of limadatem osam, as we discussed earlier. Now, if this be the case, and we look over all the pieces of the puzzle that we've presented until now, we want to ask the following question. What is the shlemus of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah? Certainly, Kriya, which we said is a kiyum of Mikra, is not the mitzvah b'shlemusa. In fact, the Gemara says that rather than reading the Megillah, you should be learning a sugya in Torah Sheba'al Peh. We're going to have a special dispensation to allow you to disturb your learning of Torah Sheba'al Peh with Havana and Amkus for the sake of listening to the words of the Megillah, which is only Torah Shebechsav. Havana, understanding, is a greater mitzvah than reading. And therefore the Shleimus HaMitzvah for Talmud Torah would certainly be a child who's capable of understanding the Torah. He's not 2 or 3, he's probably 5 or 6. And if you'll ask me, then why doesn't the Rambam indicate that this child is not just Yodea L'daber, but he's Yodea L'havin? The answer is because, again, the Rambam is talking about the mitzvah doraisa of Limadatem Osam, and it says in the pasuk L'daber bam. And for that, the Torah establishes a chiyuv doraisa on the father when the child is capable of the bare bones minimum kiyum of mikra. But now I want to ask you a different question. Granted, which would be our 5th principle, that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah b'shleimus requires Havana, in our effort to define the mitzvah of Talmud Torah on the highest level, b'shleimus, parallel to Nanuim, reading all 3 psukim of Kriyat Shema, of Ituv B'tzitzis, Yodea Lishmos Tfilav, then I would refer you to Perek Gimel of Hilchas Talmud Torah. If I had to give a title to that Perek, I would call it Keser Torah. And the Rambam says that there are 3 ksarim, there are 3 crowns that were granted by Hashem to Klal Yisrael. There's Keser Malchus, there's Keser Kahuna, and then there's Keser Torah. And the Rambam goes on to say the Keser Torah is the greatest of all 3 crowns. Keser Malchus is given to Beis David, the Davidic dynasty. Keser Kahuna is given to Aaron and the Kohanic dynasty. But Keser Torah, which is Munach Umuta Lefanav L'chol Adam, which is hefker for anyone to come along and say, I want to claim, I want to gain and achieve Keser Torah, the Ram says that's the greatest of all 3 ksarim. And therefore, if you would have a Kohen Gadol, but he's not a Talmud Chacham, he has no Keser Torah, he has Kahuna. Let's say you had a Melech who's also a Kohen. So therefore, he embodies 2 ksarim, both Keser Malchus and Keser Kahuna. But the problem is he's not a Torah scholar, call him an Amoritz. Then the Amoritz, who's not a Kohen, who's certainly not a Melech. And not only that, the Rambam says he's a Mamzer. He doesn't even have what we call Kedushas Kohol. And yet the Rambam paskins that this Keser Torah Mamzer, who will come first before the Kohen Gadol, is also the Melech. So the concept of Keser Torah is a halachic concept with ramifications in halacha. The Rambam goes on in Perek Gimel to describe the methods, the preparation, and the conditions that have to be fulfilled in order to achieve Keser Torah. And the Rambam says that the precondition for Keser Torah is lo yasiach daito l'dor macherim. The Rambam says he's totally one side, completely focused on Torah study. He's also, the Rambam says, willing to give up on physical pleasures of tanugos. For example, al aretz tishan, umayim b'msora tishta. He's just basically eating bread and water. He's sleeping on the ground, and he's memayit sheino me'enov. He has less sleep than you can imagine, and he's dedicating himself to Torah study. That is the individual who, having gone through all the conditions of hechsher, preparing himself for Keser Torah, he achieves Keser Torah. And that, I claim, this is Berzon talking, is the shlemus, is the ultimate mitzvah of Talmud Torah. There's Talmud Torah on a basic level. The Gemara even speaks about someone who reads Kriyat Shema at night and Kriyat Shema by day. And then there's Talmud Torah on a higher level to understand the Torah. And then there's the Torah on the highest level, which is called Keser Torah. That can only be achieved with the fulfillment of an entire cadre of preconditions that the Rambam outlines in Perek Gimel Milchas Talmud Torah. That is the ultimate shlemus of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And this leads me to the question that I chose to discuss with you today. And I want to share my thoughts with you. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to know the following. Is the father obligated to prepare his son for Keser Torah? What's included under V'limadatem osam es b'nechem? Certainly Torah shebechsav, certainly Torah shebal peh. But what about the highest level of Keser Torah? Should a father be training, if you will, his son to restrict the hours of sleep, restrict the enjoyments of Tanugei Olam Hazeh, in order that the child could dedicate himself to the study of Torah? And what I find fascinating is, as I always tell you, the Rambam is very sensitive to where he brings down the halacha. The halacha of teaching a son Torah shebechsav and Torah shebal peh is in Perek Aleph. The halacha of Keser Torah is in Perek Gimel, 2 chapters later. Meaning the Rambam omits any mention of Keser Torah when he deals in Perek Aleph with the obligation of the father to teach his son Torah. And to the same extent that we learn things from the Rambam when the Rambam does write it, we learn and derive conclusions from the Rambam when he doesn't write it. What we call in Hebrew, hu mashmit, he omits it. If he omits any footnote, any breath about Keser Torah in Perek Aleph, which is dedicated to the father's obligation to teach Torah to his son, then obviously he deliberately omitted Keser Torah from the circumference of V'limadatem osam es b'nechem. And the question is why? If our principle, our conclusion is correct, namely that the father does not have an obligation to teach his young son how to do X, Y, and Z in order to prepare for Keser Torah, then the question begs, why? Why was Keser Torah omitted from V'limadatem osam es b'nechem? And 2 thoughts crossed my mind, and I rejected both of them. One thought is maybe the child is too young for Keser Torah. He's got to get his 10 hours of sleep at night. He's got to eat his, drink his chocolate milk, and he's got to go to the Ferris wheel, and I don't know what else, and play hockey a couple of hours a day. I remember when I was in Canada, I had a chavrusa with someone, but he couldn't show up on Sundays because he had to take his 6-year-old son to play hockey. My gosh. Not that the Americans are any better. But be that as it may, I rejected this idea. I found that it didn't satisfy my curious mind. I don't think that technically there's a problem in what the Rambam calls in Keser Torah Per Gimel Lemay B'Shena, in teaching that to a child. Maybe not at the age of 2 and 3, but when he gets to the age of 10, 11, 12, then I think it could be appropriate, and one could argue that the father should really begin to get the child into that shvung, into that, what we call here in Hebrew, telem. The telem is like the furrow. He should get him used to, waking up a little bit earlier or going to sleep a drop later in order to dedicate himself to Talmud Torah. Train the child and prepare him for Keser Torah. Don't exclude him from Keser Torah. But then I came up with a much more profound answer, but I'm going to reject this one as well. And that is that the mitzvah of the father derived from Limadatim Osam Es B'nechem does not include Keser Torah. And I'll explain why. Limadatim Osam Es B'nechem is a pasuk, anybody know where? Parshas Vayeschanan. We recite it at least twice a day. When the Rambam in Perek Gimel establishes a chiyuv of Keser Torah, he quotes a different parsha entirely. A parsha that Amir Hashem will be reading in 3 days' time, Parshas Chukas, Zos Chukas HaTorah, Adam Ki Yamus Ba'ohel. And the Rambam, based on a Gemara, says that Ohel is Ohola Shel Torah. Right? We can learn a pasuk on many different levels. One level is that Ki Yamus Mes Ba'ohel is Ba'ohel Shel Torah. Ein HaTorah Miskayemes El B'mi Shememis Es Atzmo Ba'ohola Shel Torah. That's a whole new parsha. A parsha of sacrifice for the sake of Keser Torah in Parshas Chukas. When the Torah obligated the father in Parshas Vayeschanan, V'limadatim Osam Es B'nechem, that's Limud HaTorah. That's what I call Yedias HaTorah, but not Memis Es Atzmo HaTorah. Memis Atzmo HaTorah is a separate chiyuv that is generated by a parsha in Chukas and does not refer to Yedias HaTorah. Meaning, the fact that a child will be taught to learn Torah under very extreme conditions, like I always think of the Chayalim out there. When I was doing my miluim, they sent me to Gaza for 3 days. I remember the conditions were subhuman. You couldn't even imagine. Could imagine trying to study Torah under those conditions. That's Memis Atzmo B'Ohola Shel Torah. Would you assume that that expands the limit of Torah? Does that impact on Yedias HaTorah? I'm not sure. Ken Zayin, maybe yes, maybe no. But there's a separate entity here that's not limud, that's not expansion of Yedias HaTorah, that has to do with the human being in an extreme way trying to reach a higher level. If I could use brisket terminology, if you don't mind, do you mind? Anyone who minds, please tell me that you mind. If you don't mind, I would say that V'limadatim Osam Es B'nechem, the subject that has to be taught is the Chefza. What do I mean by the Chefza? It's the entity of Torah. Not so in Pashas Chukas of Keser Torah. It's not the entity of Torah, the Chefza of Torah, but rather the Gavra. The person should be climbing up a higher level and achieving a Mila. I would even call it a sanctity, because the three Ksarim represent three levels, or shall I say, entities of Kedusha: the sanctity of Kahuna, the sanctity of Malchus, the sanctity of Torah. Keser Torah represents the Gavra who's Niskadesh B'Kedushas HaTorah. That's not part of V'limadita. So again, if you're going to ask me, is there a mitzvah of chinuch with regard to teaching the son and preparing him for Keser Torah? I would say there's no v'limadita mosam espenechem for Keser Torah. But this answer, my friends, I reject as well. And I'll tell you why. Because the Rambam consistently, in about 15, at least 10 different places, says that the obligation of chinuch is incumbent upon the child himself. So forget about v'limadtem osam esbenechem, which is an obligation incumbent on the father. Let's talk about the mitzvah of chinuch d'Rabbanan, which l'shitas HaRambam is an obligation established by the Rabbanan, by the rabbis, to obligate the child himself. I mean, the Rambam goes very far with this. The Rambam says that when a child finishes eating a suda, and he ate what's called kibetza, he benches, he could be motzi a gadol who only ate kizayis. Because the child is obligated to Rabbanan, and now the gadol is obligated to Rabbanan. They both have the same level, and therefore one could be motzi the other. But you see clearly that the child is obligated in Birkas Hamazon. And you could go on and on and on with this. The Rambam consistently repeats that the child is obligated, whether it be tzitzis, whether it be sukkah, lulav, over and over again. The Rambam has it. So therefore, I want to raise the following question. Shouldn't the child be obligated under the law of chinuch to the same extent that he's obligated to do nanuim in lulav and to be mevarich Birkas Hamazon with all the brachos and not skimp and not cut out, because his obligation of chinuch, as established by the Rabban, is to achieve the shleimus HaMitzvah, as we established here today? Then the child should be obligated in Talmud Torah even if he has no father. Or alternatively, if his father, for whatever reason, did not teach him Torah, the child now picks up the mitzvah. My father, let's say, didn't teach me tzitzis. I, as a child, have to learn tzitzis. My father didn't teach me tefillin. I have to put on tefillin. My father didn't teach me to fast on Yom Kippur. I have to fast on Yom Kippur. Because the obligation of chinuch is incumbent on the child. That is the Rambam's consistent shita. And therefore, I grant you that even if v'limadtem in Parshas Va'eschanan does not include Zos Chukas HaTorah Adam Kiyomis Ba'oel of Keser Torah, and therefore their father's obligation of v'limadtem Moses B'nei Chavizvi, his son, does not encompass Keser Torah, but what about the child himself? The child himself, independent of his father, has an obligation to fulfill the mitzvos based on the chiyuv d'Rabbanan of chinuch. Where is the mitzvah of chinuch with regard to the child's obligation to prepare himself for Keser Torah? Somewhere it got lost in the shuffle. And the question is why? I want to suggest the following. Rashi, and I'll get back to the Rambam, in Masechta Brachos writes that a child is not obligated in Kriyat Shema. Period. There's no mitzvah chinuch. Why? So Rashi comes up with a very technical answer. And that is that Kriyat Shema requires Zmanei Tefillah, Zmanei Kriyat Shema. Shachris and Arvis, Shalbechav Kumech. The child is totally dependent upon his father for Zmanei Kriyat Shema. I mean, today, again, every child could be 5 years old, has a watch. That's probably more sophisticated than my watch. But the child is not time aware, says Rashi. He needs his father. So if there's an obligation of Kriyat Shema in Chinuch, then it's on the father. But we cannot obligate the child. I call it for a technical foul because the Rashi says, Hayeled Eino Matsui Tamid Eitzel Aviv. He's not always with his father, ready for his father to tell him, hey, buddy, time for Kriyat Shema. But we see one thing from Rashi, that fundamentally, Kriyat Shema should be included under the mitzvah of Chinuch, and the child should be obligated in Chinuch of Kriyat Shema, except for the fact that he's totally dependent on his father. I found something similar in the Rambam Hilchas Chagiga with regard to Aliyah Baregel. The Rambam says that the father has to take the child up to the Harabayis for Aliyah L'Regel. The implication is that the obligation is on the father, not on the son, which is unusual in the matrix of the Rambam's understanding of Chinuch. And maybe when it comes to going up to the Harabayis, from Dan to Beersheba up to the Harabayis, maybe the child, even if he's very brilliant and sophisticated, but he's not capable of making the trek. The father was obligated because the child can't do it. So what I'm trying to develop is that there may be an idea of a technical problem in obligating the child in certain specific mitzvahs because the child cannot be independent of his father. But now we get to the Rambam and Tefillah. The Rambam and Tefillah, which according to the Rambam is a mitzvah d'oraisa, once a day to daven, doesn't matter what time, obligates the child in Tefillah. The child has to daven. When the Rambam gets to Kriyat Shema, in Hilchos Kriyat Shema, he omits the obligation of the child to recite Kriyat Shema, without mentioning Rashi's technicality that the father is not around and the child's not always, next to his father. It seems to me that the Rambam might be making a fundamental distinction between Tefillah and Kriyat Shema. Let me explain. The Gemara says about Tefillah, Tefillah by Rachme. What does Rachme mean? We need Rachme Shamayim. Anyone who thinks he can rely on the President of the United States, forget it. We need Rachme Shamayim. No politics here. Okay, sorry. I'm just very tzihitz about this whole thing. Anyway, now, let me ask you a question. Be honest with me. Does an adult need Rachme Shamayim and a child does not? And the Gemara says that a woman is obligated in tefillah once a day because she needs Rachme Shamayim no less than a man. And I would go a step further and apply the same yardstick to a child. A child needs rachmei shamayim. When a child prays, he might not be bar mitzvah, he's not chayav in tefillah d'oraisa, but he needs rachmei. So what am I trying to drive at? A child has tefillah. The entity of tefillah exists for a child. I'll give you an example of what I have in mind. There's halacha that you're not allowed to walk in front of a mispalel. And there are two interpretations of that. Some say because it'll distract the mispalel if you walk in front of him within dalet amos, circumference, blah, blah, blah. And if it only applies in front of him, it doesn't apply behind him. But some say no. We draw a circumference of dalet amos around the mispalel. The mispalel is the point in the middle of this whole circle. Why? Apparently, we don't walk in a place where there's tefillah. Tefillah is shechina. And it's not proper to walk, to get from one point to another point by going through the shechina. Excuse me, shechina, I got to go. You could do that at a concert and ask the guys in charge of the aisles, make sure that I have room to get to my seat because this guy's sitting here. But not with regard to tefillah. Would that halacha apply to a child who's davening? So if you say that a child davening is just perfunctory, it's just mechanics, he's just learning how to do it, and he's mumbling the words, then it's not a hefter shel tefillah. But if you're going to argue that a child by rachmei, he needs rachamim, then his tefillah is rachamim, and it might generate new dinim. Says the Rambam, if the child could create tefillah, and the essence of tefillah is not the words, what we call the maisa amira, but rather the rachmei of tefillah, then the child is obligated in tefillah. His father is obligated to teach him, but if there's no father around, he has to teach himself. Kriya Shema is a maisa kriya. And the Rambam would say, l'chora, that if it's very difficult for the child to read, he can't read all three prakim, he doesn't know about Zmanei Kriyat Shema, and so forth and so on, maybe the Rambam would say that he's exempt from Kriyat Shema. But tefillah? Oh no. Child is obligated. Now I want to apply that to Talmud Torah. Let's see if we could work out the same principles and apply them to Talmud Torah. And we ask the following question: does a child have a chefza shel Torah? Does he create an entity of Torah? For example, when you create an entity of Torah, you're not allowed to walk into a bathhouse. A child is thinking divrei Torah. Can he enter into a bathhouse? I don't know. I have to look it up in the poskim, but I would say logically he cannot. For example, the Gemara says in Megillah that a child is ola leminyan shiva, which means that when you have to call 7 people over to the Torah, you can call up a katan. The minig is not like that. For kavod hatzibur, whatever it is, technicalities. How can a child be called up to the Torah if he doesn't create a chefta shel Torah? Now, he's the reader, I mean, doesn't matter who the Balkari is, he's the reader. And if you would ask me any question about Birchas HaTorah, I would say that the child is obligated in Birchas HaTorah. I would say that a woman is obligated in Birchas HaTorah because she has a chefta shel Torah. She might not be obligated in Talmud Torah, but she does create if she decides voluntarily to learn Torah. She creates a chefta shel Torah and she makes a bracha on the chefta shel Torah. Child makes a bracha on a chefta shel Torah. If this be the case, Rabbosai, then maybe I could begin to suggest why is it that the Rabbana never established a chiyuv on the child vis-a-vis Keser Torah. Because as we said before, there's one entity called Torah, and there's another entity in the Gavra of, shall we call it, hiskadrus, meaning reaching a higher level. That higher level is a kiyum of Keser Torah in the Gavra, but not in the Hefzer Shel Torah. So when the Rabbanan decided that a child is obligated in Torah study as a rabbinic institution, they were talking about Limud Torah. They were talking about the Hefzer Shel Torah. A child could create and generate a Hefzer Shel Torah, therefore he's obligated in Torah, just like the Gemara says that a woman could create tefillah, and therefore she's obligated in tefillah. But as far as chiyuvei gavra are concerned, to be makadesh the gavra with something that goes beyond the greatest mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and that's Keser Torah, his kachas hagavra was not part of the takonis chachamim of Chinuch. The Rabbanan don't obligate you to be makadesh or be miskadesh if you're a katan. For example, I would tell you that a nazir who accepts upon himself Nazirus is miskadesh b'kedushas nazir. I don't believe for one moment that there's a mitzvah of chinuch on a drabanan level to get a child to become a nazir. That's kiddush hagavra. Although I have to tell you that the Gemara says in Idarim that of Mazir is beno akatan b'nazirus. Interesting. But the Rambam says that's halacha Moshe Sinai. That's a separate doraisa halacha, that the father could accept nazirus for the child. But if you'd ask me about chinuch the Rabbanan, I don't believe for 1 minute that the Rabbanan would obligate a father to teach his son, educate him, and prepare him to be a nazir. It'd be pretty wild if that was the halacha. Because Kiddush HaGavra is something that's on the Gavra who's a bar chiyuv. He's already 13 years old. He's a bar mitzvah, not on a child. The child has Maaseh mitzvah, but he doesn't have Kiddush HaGavra. And for example, in Tzitzis, if I were to tell you that Tcheles is a separate mitzvah, which by the way is not so at all, but just for the sake of L'saber Ta'ozen, to convey a message, let's say I would tell you that the mitzvah of tzitzis is chutei lavan. And when the Torah obligates you to add a psil tcheles, that's for kiddush hagavra. Of course, the tcheles reminds you of the kisei hakavod, and you reach a higher level, and it's makadesh the person. I would say there's no chinuch to teach the child to eat tcheles. Again, what I just told you is not right, because tcheles is an essential part, machlokas Rebbe and Chacham, whether it's ma'akev is halavan, but everybody agrees it's part of the same mitzvah of tzitzis. Let me ask you the following question. What is the mitzvah of tefillin? Put on the tefillin and take them off? Let me read to you the Rambam in Hilchos Tefillin. I think you have it in the pages that David sent you. This is the Rambam in Perek Dalet Halacha Chaf Hei of Hilchos Tefillin. Kedushas Tefillin Kedushasam Gedolahi. And the Rambam compares it to the tzitz that's worn on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol. And the Rambam goes on to say all the things that impact on a person when he wears tefillin, who anav, yirei shamayim, nimsha eno nimsha peschok, b'chsicha b'tela, nimahar b'machshavas ros, etc., etc. Lefichach, says the Rambam. What I told you about the Kedushas Tefillin Kedushasam Gedola is not just a Musar shmuz. It has halachic ramifications, says the Rama Lefichach. Tzarech Adam Lishtadel Liosan Olav Kol Hayom. My father told me about his grandfather, his maternal grandfather. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Sorkin. That my father does not remember him without tefillin. And my father used to remember things that happened to him when he was 2 years old. And he left Lita when he was 12. And a Torah machazeres achar yildea, my grandchildren who learn in the old city wear tefillin the whole day long, going back a few generations. Now the Rambam adds 3 words. After he writes tzarech adam lishtadel liyosam olav kol hayom, which means, all right, you want a higher level, wear them the whole day. But then he adds 3 words. Shemitzvasan kachi. Why did the Rambam add those 3 words? I looked around, I didn't find anything. I'm telling you that I believe that the Rambam holds that wearing tefillin the whole day is not just adding to the mitzvah. Like I sit in sukkah for an hour. Oh, why don't you sit in sukkah for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours? No. The Rambam is telling me, Svasan Kachi, that wearing tefillin the whole day puts you into an entirely different category, and that's part of the mitzvah of tefillin. So what I'd like to suggest here, Abosai, would there be a mitzvah of Chinuch to educate my child that he should wear tefillin the whole day? I would like to compare it to Keser Torah. What do I mean? We said in Keser Torah that the Rabbanan did not generate and establish a chiyuv chinuch for Keser Torah on a child. Child is not obligated in Keser Torah, even though you'd say that's the shleimus ha-mitzvah, and the child should strive for the shleimus ha-mitzvah. Nay, the shleimus ha-mitzvah is in the chefta shel Torah, but not in the kiddush hagavra. And I would like to suggest that the Rambam holds that tefillin has 2 parts to it. It's got the hanochas ha-tefillin, and then, of course, it's having the tefillin on your body, and then there's kiddush hagavra. That's also part of the mitzvah of tefillin, but that applies in mitzvahs and kol hayom. And the Rabbanu would not establish a chiyuv chinuch on mitzvahs and kol hayom. So my obligation to teach my son tefillin, my son's obligation vis-a-vis tefillin is hanochas ha-tefillin, to put on the tefillin, to have the tefillin on the body of the child. That's what the father is obligated. That's what the child is obligated. But as far as kol hayom, although that is the mitzvah of tefillin b'shleimus, but that's b'toras kiddush hagavra. That's already one step removed from the primary mitzvah of hanochas tefillin. And that far the Rabbanan didn't go with regard to chinuch. Let me conclude, because time is going on us, with a thought that crossed my mind. And I know I'm wrong, but I don't know why, because I think it's logical. The Rambam in Hilchas Bias Migdash has a long, intricate discussion about Tvila b'mikvah. Because a Kohen, if he's Tameh, is enjoined from doing the avodah in the Migdash. And the Rambam says that on a daily basis, before the Kohen does the avodah, he's required to do what's called Kiddush Yadayim v'Raglayim. Then the Rambam adds another line. You'll look it up if you have a chance. Perkei Milchus Bias Migdash. The Rambam says that he has to be tovel his body in a mikvah. What's going on over here? If he was tameh, fashtetzach, he has to be tovel. He already did kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, which is the machshir for the avodah. Why does he need tvila b'mikvah? So I'm wondering if avodah b'migdash, and maybe even bias migdash, has 2 parts to it. The basic mitzvah is to remove whatever you have to remove, all the contaminations and so forth and so on. But then there's a positive command of tefillah. And that tefillah is a tefillah shel kiddush. It's kind of like the difference between sur meira and asay tov, if you know what I mean. In other words, normal tefillah, and certainly kiddush yadayim reglaim, is sur meira. Get rid of, all those contaminations. But then there's an asay tov. There's hiskadjus al yedei tefillah. When a person immerses himself, maybe that's the reason why Hasidim, go to mikveh every day, even if it's not a carry situation. It's hiskadjus al yedei tefillah. It's interesting because the Rambam in Hilchos Avodas Yom HaKippurim has 10 tefillos of the Kohen Gadol, but he says they're all Bakodesh. Now we have the excavations in the Kotel. They know exactly where the Kohen Gadol did tefillah. But he says the tefillah Rishona, the first of the 10, is not for Tumah. And therefore he could be tovel outside the Mikdash. Maybe that too is a tefillah shel hiskadjus. Even though he was poresh mi ishto for 7 days, he was, what's it called in English? Help me out here, guys. When a person has to be away from the whole community, what's it called? I think it starts with a Q, no?
Quarantine.
So the Kohen Gadol was already quarantined for a full week. But nevertheless, on top of that, maybe there's another chiyuv tefillah, which is sort of like the culmination of the kiddush of those 7 days of prisha, of quarantining. And again, I don't know if a father is obligated to teach his son, if the father's a Kohen, if the son is a Katan, to teach him the laws of Avodas Kahuna. I don't know if there is such a Takanas Chinuch. That's why I think maybe this whole thing I'm telling you is wrong. But offhand, although I don't find any source for this, but I just intuitively think that the child should be taught how to do the avodah. So the vayah, when the day comes and he's bar mitzvah, and they call upon him to do the avodah, he doesn't start from aleph base. And the avodah of a Kohen, if he went ahead and did the avodah, is kshera. So why not obligate the father to teach his son, one Kohen to his son who's a Kohen? Like, for example, you'll see in Birchas Kohanim. Have you ever seen it? Where they bring up these young children to do Birchas Kohanim? I think that's Chinuch. So if there's Chinuch for Birchas Kohanim, maybe there's Chinuch for the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. I don't know. If you can Google it or something, let me know. You know my email address. Would there be chinuch for the tefillah of hiskadjus? You see, if you're talking about that which is absolutely critical to get rid of tumah, a tefillah hamitaheres, no question about it. If there is chinuch, then it's got to include tefillah. But if you talk about that separate tefillah when there's no reason to suspect that the person is tameh, he's already gone through all the processes of tahara, and it's only a tefillah of kiddush, of hiskadjus, then I'm going to claim there's no chinuch on hiskadjus. And therefore there's no chinuch on wearing tefillin the whole day, and there's no chinuch on Keser Torah. I don't know. You're the jury. I haven't discussed this with anyone. Just with you, my good friends from Canada and from Israel. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And if you can give it some thought and let